Usually, when we talk about curing global health epidemics or, solving the environmental crisis of water depletion, we have this very specific expectation of where the solutions are supposed to come from.
Right. Yeah, like we
Mm.
expect it to be some huge policy shift.
Exactly. We think of governments passing these sweeping historic laws, or maybe we think of brilliant scientists in university labs or, I don't know, agile tech startups out of Silicon Valley.
Right, the disruptors.
Yeah, but we definitely do not usually look at the company responsible for pumping out billions of chocolate bars, instant coffees, and processed snacks.
No, it completely challenges our basic assumptions about corporate motives, really. I mean, we tend to look toward the traditional engines of public policy or pure philanthropy to solve massive issues, not the packaged food aisle.
But when you step into the world of the global food supply, the entire landscape just shifts. So today we're unpacking a truly fascinating Harvard Business School case study on Nestle.
Which is a massive, massive company.
Oh yeah, a $90 billion behemoth with like 8,500 brands sold across 197 countries. And specifically, we are looking at their strategy called Creating Shared Value, or CSV.
Right.
And just to be clear right out of the gate for you listening, we aren't just reading from some glossy corporate PR brochure here.
No, definitely not.
We are looking at a hard analytical case study of how a heritage corporation realized that traditional corporate philanthropy, writing a check to a charity at the end of the year was a complete dead end.
Yeah, they basically realized they had to literally engineer social good into the mechanics of their supply chain and their profit model just to survive the 21st century.
Exactly. And it's crucial that we establish our analytical lens for this deep dive.
Right, because we aren't here to cheerlead for big food, nor are we here to issue some universal condemnation.
Yeah, that's not the goal.
Our mission is to synthesize the data provided in this research. We're looking at the raw mechanics of a corporate giant trying to steer a very heavy ship through what was basically a perfect storm.
A storm made up of shifting consumer habits, severe global water scarcity, and genuine public health epidemics. So whether you run a small business or you're an entrepreneur or you just want to understand the food in your pantry, this is going to be incredibly relevant to you.
Because it's about fundamentally aligning long-term value creation with solving massive real-world problems.
Right. So let's start by understanding that storm. Because to really appreciate how much trouble the food and beverage sector was in by the late 1990s, I think we have to look at how incredibly stable it used to be.
Oh, it was the ultimate safe bet.
Right. For over a century, this sector, which was dominated by players like Nestle, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Unilever, it was considered practically recession-proof.
Yeah, bulletproof.
So how did they achieve that level of invulnerability for so long? I mean, what was the secret?
Well, it really comes down to the historical context of food technology. If you go back to like the 18th and 19th centuries, the commercial food landscape as we know it simply didn't exist.
Right. People just ate what was fresh?
Exactly. What was fresh, what was local, and what was in season. But then came preservation technologies. First canning, then pasteurization, and eventually commercial refrigeration and global transportation networks.
Which changes everything.
It does. These technologies allowed companies to produce foods with incredibly long shelf lives and distribute them across vast distances. So for most of the 20th century, the formula for massive, easy profits was really simple.
You sold convenience and you sold shelf life.
Exactly.
Right, especially as societal dynamics shifted in the mid-20th century, like more women entering the workforce, for example. Time became a luxury, so convenience became the ultimate premium product.
Yeah, it was a golden age for these companies.
But the case study outlines a massive fracture in this model. Sometime around the late 1990s and early 2000s, this guaranteed profit engine just started to sputter. Why did the golden age end so abruptly?
It happened on multiple fronts simultaneously. The first fracture was the retail squeeze.
Okay, the retail squeeze.
Yeah, the retail landscape consolidated massively during this period. You had the aggressive rise of giant mass merchandisers. Think of your Walmarts and your Costcos.
Right, the big box stores.
Yeah. And because of their sheer size and unparalleled purchasing power, they fundamentally changed the power dynamic. They could dictate terms to the food manufacturers, demanding lower wholesale prices.
Which instantly eats into the profit margins of companies like Nestle and Kraft.
Exactly.
But wait, couldn't the food giants just say no? Like, they had the brand names that consumers actually wanted. If Walmart didn't stock Oreo cookies or Nescafe, wouldn't shoppers just go somewhere else?
Well, that is exactly what the food companies thought. But the retailers were a step ahead. They didn't just use aggressive negotiation tactics.
What did they do?
They started heavily expanding their own low-price, in-house generic brands. And they gave those store brands premium placement right on the shelves next to the big names.
Ah, right, the store brands.
Yeah.
So instead of just negotiating on price behind closed doors, the retailer becomes a direct competitor right inside their own store.
Exactly. And that dynamic vastly accelerated after the 2008 financial crisis.
Oh, sure, when everyone was tightening their belts.
Right. When consumers experienced severe economic shock, they actively looked to save money anywhere they could. So that brand premium, that extra dollar or two you would willingly pay just because a product had a familiar logo on the box, it started to seriously erode.
Because people realized the generic store brand was essentially the same product for like 20% less.
Exactly.
So the financial model is under attack from the retailers. But from reading the case, that almost seems like a standard business cycle problem. Just standard market competition.
Right. It's just margin pressure.
Yeah. The much bigger, entirely existential threat was the global public health crisis.
Yes. The statistics from the research are truly staggering, and they highlight a structural failure in the whole big food model. Between 1980 and 2014, global obesity rates doubled.
Doubled. That's insane.
We are talking about 2 billion adults globally classified as overweight, and 600 million of those considered obese.
And this wasn't just an American phenomenon, right? Because I think we often think of the processed food epidemic as very localized to the U.S. diet.
No, not at all. It was a rapid global shift. In countries like Mexico, Venezuela, Uruguay, and Chile, 70% of the population was suddenly overweight or obese.
Wow, 70%.
Yeah. And the processed food sector, with its heavy reliance on cheap, sugary, salty, high-calorie products, was directly implicated as the primary driver of this epidemic.
That is a terrifying shift in public perception for a company. I mean, you go from being the beloved provider of modern, convenient family dinners to being actively blamed for a global health epidemic.
It's a massive PR nightmare.
But even if people ignored the health consequences and just kept eating the food, the case study points out a hard physical limitation, the resource crisis. And honestly, the numbers on water usage completely blew my mind.
Oh, it is the unseen bottleneck of the entire industry. Agriculture uses roughly 70% of the world's accessible freshwater. Yeah, and the projections from the early 2000s showed that by 2025, a full fifth of the global population would be living in severely water-scarce regions.
Can you break down what that actually means for a single product? Because 70% of global freshwater is almost too big of a number for me to even comprehend.
Sure, let's look at the micro level. The case study notes that it takes 46 gallons of water to produce the ingredients for a single 12-ounce can of soda.
Wait, 46 gallons of water for one tiny can of soda? How is that even physically possible?
Well, you have to factor in the entire agricultural life cycle. It's the water required to grow the sugar cane, or the corn for the high fructose corn syrup, plus the water to process it, to clean the massive manufacturing equipment, and to cool the bottling plants.
Oh, right. It's not just the water inside the can.
Exactly. Another example, it takes 63 gallons of water to produce a single 8-ounce glass of milk.
Wow.
Yeah, when you factor in the water the cow drinks and the massive amount of water required to grow the alfalfa or grain that the cow eats.
Okay, so when you are a multinational company producing literally billions of these individual items every single week, your vulnerability to regional water scarcity isn't just a potential PR issue. It is a hard operational wall.
Exactly. You literally cannot make the product.
And then you add the human element of the supply chain on top of the water crisis. The text states that 70% of the world's food is produced by 2.5 billion smallholder farmers.
Yes. These are individuals farming incredibly small plots of land, often less than 2 hectares, and they are living in deep systemic poverty.
Right.
The yields on these small, under-resourced farms are up to 90% lower than what you see on modern, mechanized commercial farms.
So wait, the foundation of this multi-billion-dollar, hyper-modern food industry is actually reliant on massive populations of people farming with methods that are basically centuries old.
Yes. And because they are trapped in poverty, the agricultural practices become desperate and destructive.
Because they have no other choice.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when a farmer cannot afford modern fertilizer or irrigation, the only way to increase their yield just to survive is to clear more land, which leads to massive deforestation.
Like the palm oil issue.
Exactly. The case highlights the 6 million hectares of forest lost in Indonesia between 2000 and 2012, which was largely driven by the aggressive expansion of palm oil production.
And it drives systemic child labor too, right?
Unfortunately, yes. When margins are practically zero, farmers pull their children out of school to work the fields. There were an estimated 1.1 million children working just on global cocoa farms during this period.
Think about how terrifying that is from a corporate boardroom perspective. Let me give you an analogy. It's like being the world's absolute best manufacturer of typewriters right at the exact moment the personal computer is invented.
That's a great way to put it.
But actually, it's worse than that. Because your typewriters are also suddenly being blamed for making people chronically sick, and the specific metal you need to build those typewriters is rapidly running out across the globe, and the people mining that metal are embroiled in massive human rights controversies. Am I understanding the level of corporate panic correctly?
That captures the existential dread perfectly. It completely explains the panic that swept through the industry. The fundamental inputs, the water, the cocoa, the palm oil, were either physically running out or becoming so heavily associated with severe environmental and human rights abuses that they were toxic to the brand's equity.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the outputs, the sugary, salty processed foods, were being actively rejected by health-conscious consumers. And crucially, they were increasingly being targeted by government regulation.
Great. The taxes. Governments weren't just writing angry letters anymore. They were stepping in. The case study mentions that by 2011, 14 different U.S. states were proposing soda taxes.
And in 2015, Mexico took decisive national action. They implemented a 10% tax on sugar-sweetened drinks and an 8% tax on high-calorie foods.
Which is huge.
It forced the entire big food cartel to react. They were all standing on this burning platform together. But what is truly fascinating for an analyst to observe is that they all chose wildly different lifeboats to try and escape the fire.
Okay, so the entire industry is staring down this barrel of water scarcity, retail squeezing, and health taxes. Did they all just accept defeat? Or did we see competitors try to fight their way out of it? Let's look at the different strategies deployed by Nestlé's biggest rivals, starting with PepsiCo.
Right, so PepsiCo, under the leadership of CEO Indra Nooyi, tried to innovate their marketing and product mix. They introduced what they called their good-for-you and better-for-you product lines.
I remember those commercials.
Yeah. They made very public, ambitious promises, like a commitment to achieve a 25% reduction in sodium across their entire global portfolio by 2015. They even opened a specialized research center in Mexico, specifically to develop healthier snacks that would appeal to local palates while meeting those new regulatory demands.
But I remember those good-for-you campaigns, and it always felt like kind of a side project compared to the sheer volume of traditional Pepsi and Doritos being sold. Did that strategy actually work financially?
Well, the underlying reality was incredibly tough. Traditional soda volumes were in a secular long-term decline. People were simply drinking less full-sugar soda across the board.
Right.
So while leadership was pushing the good-for-you narrative to appease investors and health advocates, the actual financial engine of the company was relying heavily on brutal internal cost-cutting to maintain their profit margins.
How brutal are we talking? Like clipping coupons?
More like thousands of jobs. We're talking about $3 billion slashed from operational budgets from 2012 to 2014, and then management proposing another $5 billion in cuts for the 2015 to 2019 window.
Wow.
Yeah, and cost-cutting is fundamentally a defensive maneuver. You can only cut your way to profitability for so long before you start degrading the core capabilities of the company.
So Pepsi tried to market a health pivot while quietly slashing costs in the background. What about Unilever? Because they are massive in the food space, too.
Unilever, led by Paul Polman, took a highly publicized, incredibly ambitious route. Polman launched the Sustainable Living Plan, aiming to literally halve the company's entire global environmental footprint.
Which sounds amazing.
It does. And Polman himself became a massive global ambassador for corporate sustainability, speaking at the UN and Davos. But if you look past the speeches and analyze their actual business strategy during this time, they essentially made a strategic decision to slowly exit the food business altogether.
I have to admit, that was wild to read in the case study. A heritage food giant just deciding not to be a food giant anymore.
But the numbers tell the story. From 2005 to 2015, food dropped from representing 55% of Unilever's total revenues down to just 43%.
So what did they replace it with?
They aggressively leaned into their personal care and home care divisions. Soaps, shampoos, deodorants, detergents. The case study notes they were even reclassified on major financial stock indexes. They went from being tracked as a packaged food company to being tracked as a personal products company.
They just slowly walked away from the burning platform.
Pretty much.
Which, I mean, is an effective strategy for their shareholders, but it doesn't really solve the global food crisis. It just hands the problem to someone else. Now, what about Coca-Cola? Because if Pepsi tried to pivot and Unilever walked away, Coke seems like the company that would just dig its heels in.
And you'd be exactly right. Coca-Cola took a much more combative, entrenched approach. Coke, often working alongside Pepsi and the American Beverage Association, spent heavily to lobby against those impending soda taxes.
How heavily?
We were talking about tens of millions of dollars, roughly $70 million spent trying to kill those legislative efforts.
And that combative approach led to some massive PR nightmares, right?
Yeah.
The detail in the text about their chief science officer is pretty staggering.
Yes. Coke's chief science and health officer was forced to resign amidst a massive scandal. Investigative journalists revealed that Coca-Cola had secretly provided funding to a seemingly independent NGO and various academic researchers.
And what was the purpose of that funding?
The goal was to intentionally shift the public blame for the obesity crisis away from sugary dietary habits and entirely onto a lack of physical exercise.
It's the old energy balance argument. Like, it's not the Coke making you sick, it's the fact that you didn't go for a run today.
Exactly. But when the funding ties were exposed, the backlash was fierce. And it really highlights the hard limits of trying to PR or lobby your way out of a fundamental product issue.
Because people see right through it eventually.
Exactly. And despite all that massive lobbying spend and the aggressive PR spin, Coca-Cola's sales still dropped 7.8% from 2012 to 2015. Consumers were changing their habits regardless of the advertising.
Okay, so we have Pepsi's defensive cost-cutting, Unilever's quiet exit, and Coke's aggressive lobbying. What about the Kraft empire?
Well, Mondelez, which was formed from the spin-off of Kraft Foods, tried a bit of everything, but ultimately fell victim to the financial markets. They pledged to help 200,000 cocoa farmers and promised to reduce sodium.
Sounds good so far.
But they were under intense, relentless pressure from activist investors who demanded better, immediate short-term returns. This pressure culminated in massive M&A activity, most notably Kraft merging with Heinz.
Oh, right, the Kraft-Heinz merger.
Yeah, and this merger was orchestrated by the private equity firm 3G Capital and Warren Buffett.
And 3G Capital is famous for one very specific thing, right?
Zero-based budgeting and ruthless, deep cost cuts. The strategy there was entirely financial engineering. They targeted $1.5 billion in operational cuts in just 2 years to satisfy the financial markets, largely ignoring the broader structural issues of the food system entirely.
So if pure financial engineering, lobbying, exiting the industry, and defensive cost-cutting are the dominant industry responses, is anyone actually trying to fix the underlying mechanism of how food is made and sold? Because I looked at Danone in the case study, and they seem to try something genuinely different.
Danone is a very interesting counterexample. They took a portfolio approach. They systematically divested from product lines deemed unhealthy. Like they sold off their very profitable beer and cheese businesses to focus their capital entirely on fresh dairy, bottled water, baby food, and medical nutrition.
Okay.
And they made a highly publicized move by partnering with Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel laureate.
Right, they set up a social enterprise in Bangladesh to create nutritionally fortified yogurt. It sounds like the perfect utopian corporate response. A massive corporation partnering with a Nobel Peace Prize winner to feed children.
It was set up as a pure social enterprise, meaning the mandate was that all profits generated by this yogurt factory would be reinvested locally to expand the social benefit rather than distributed upward to Danone shareholders. They engineered a factory to make fortified yogurt specifically priced for people living on less than $2 a day to fight endemic malnutrition.
But wait, the case study throws a massive bucket of cold water on this. For all the awards and press releases that partnership generated, it explicitly states that the Bangladesh project stalled. Why did it fail to scale?
It stalled due to persistent, brutal pricing pressure and distribution problems. When your target consumer lives on less than $2 a day, your margins are practically non-existent.
Oh, so any tiny fluctuation ruins the math.
Exactly. Any fluctuation in the cost of milk or transportation completely wipes out the model. Furthermore, maintaining a refrigerated supply chain for yogurt in rural Bangladesh is logistically immense. The social enterprise model, while noble, struggled to achieve the sheer scale and efficiency of a traditional profit-driven capitalist supply chain.
This is the crux of the entire deep dive right here. If pure philanthropy or a social enterprise doesn't scale because it lacks a profit motive, and brutal cost-cutting or lobbying doesn't fix the underlying problem because it ignores the reality of the crisis, What is the alternative? How do you actually fix the core business model without just selling it off or squeezing your workforce to death?
This raises the most important question of the case, and it explains why Nestle chose a totally different path. But to understand why Nestle reacted differently than Pepsi or Kraft in the 2000s, we actually have to look backward. We have to look at the unique corporate DNA and a massive historical trauma that profoundly shaped Nestle's psychology decades before this 21st century crisis even began.
Okay, let's dive into that history. Because Nestle wasn't founded in a modern boardroom by private equity managers looking to maximize shareholder value on junk food. The origin story is entirely different.
It is.
It was founded in 1867 by Henri Nestle, a German pharmacist living in Switzerland. And he didn't invent a candy bar. He created an infant cereal made of wheat flour, sugar, and cow's milk, specifically designed to save the lives of babies who couldn't breastfeed.
And that origin is vital to understanding their corporate self-image. The company literally started as a medical nutritional intervention. And as they grew, their expansion strategy reflected an understanding of deep supply chain integration. In 1905, when they merged with the Anglo-Swiss Condensed Milk Company, they adopted what was called the Milk District model.
What exactly is a milk district?
Rather than just setting up a processing factory in a new country and demanding that the local market supply them with raw milk, they realized that in developing nations, the infrastructure to provide high-quality milk simply didn't exist. So they built it themselves.
The example of the Moga region in India from the 1960s really illustrates this well. The text describes Moga as an area of deep structural poverty back then. There was no clean water, no electricity. The local farmers had a few buffalo, but they used the milk primarily for their own homes. Right. If they had any extra to sell, the supply chain was so informal that the milk was often diluted with dirty water by middlemen before it even reached a market.
Exactly. And Nestle wanted to build a modern dairy plant there. But they couldn't just put out a purchase order for 1 million liters of pristine milk. They had to engineer the local society to produce it.
How do you even start doing that?
They brought in agricultural extension workers, literally company employees who went farm to farm. They taught the local impoverished farmers modern animal husbandry and veterinary practices. They financed the drilling of deep water wells to ensure clean water for the animals.
Wow.
Yeah, they built a localized refrigerated supply chain, known as a cold chain, to ensure the milk didn't spoil in the Indian heat. And most importantly, they bypassed those corrupt middlemen and paid transparent premium prices directly to the farmers for high-quality milk.
And the result over 50 years was the complete economic transformation of the region. Marga turned from a deeply impoverished area into a thriving, wealthy dairy cluster with better health outcomes, higher local incomes, and better education infrastructure.
This experience taught Nestle early on that deeply integrating with and elevating the local supply chain wasn't charity. It was exceptionally good for long-term business resilience.
But this institutional confidence was severely shaken by the defining crucible of the company's history in the late 1970s, the global infant formula boycott.
Yes, this is the trauma.
In the late 70s, activist groups launched a massive, coordinated global boycott against Nestle. The accusation was that the company was aggressively and unethically marketing its infant formula in developing countries, effectively discouraging new mothers from natural breastfeeding.
The tragic reality on the ground was a collision between a highly engineered product and a developing world context. Many of the mothers in these regions were illiterate and couldn't read the exact preparation instructions on the formula tins.
Which is incredibly dangerous.
It is. Because the formula was expensive relative to their income, they would over-dilute the powder to make a single tin last longer, stripping the baby of necessary calories. Or, crucially, they would mix the powder with contaminated local water.
And this was directly leading to severe infant malnutrition, disease, and in many cases, death. The product designed to save lives in 1867 was now implicated in ending them. Think about how terrifying that is from a corporate perspective.
It's the ultimate nightmare scenario.
Right. Imagine your absolute flagship product, the very foundation of your company's identity, is suddenly tied in the global press to infant mortality. You don't just put out a carefully worded PR statement and move on. That kind of profound crisis fundamentally rewires a corporation's psychology.
It does. The public backlash was immense and sustained. In 1981, Nestlé's CEO at the time, Helmut Macher, realized he had to fundamentally change the way the company operated to survive. He didn't just fight the activists in court, he actually met directly with the boycott organizers. Yeah. He agreed to strictly implement the World Health Organization's International Code for Marketing Breast Milk Substitutes.
Which meant what, practically speaking?
It meant they completely stopped marketing formula directly to mothers in these developing nations. No more billboards, no more radio ads targeting consumers. They restricted their marketing entirely to health professionals.
Oh, I see.
And to ensure compliance and rebuild trust, they created an independent nutrition institute. This institute was strictly firewalled. It wasn't allowed to promote Nestlé products at all. Its sole mandate was to educate local doctors and nurses on general pediatric nutrition.
So did going through that intense fire actually give Nestlé an advantage when the larger industry-wide food crisis hit 20 years later?
It absolutely did. It gave them a crucial, decades-long head start on understanding corporate responsibility. While companies like Coca-Cola were clumsily trying to lobby their way out of the obesity crisis in the 2010s, Nestlé had already learned a painful lesson in the 1980s. A company cannot simply sell a product and willfully ignore the societal context in which it is used. You cannot divorce the product from the consumer's reality. The infant formula crisis forced Nestlé to institutionalize rigorous scientific research, ethical marketing compliance, and proactive stakeholder engagement long before their competitors were forced to even think about those concepts.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the massive corporate pivot in 1997. Peter Brabeck-Letmathe takes over as the new CEO of Nestlé. He looks at this sprawling, historic food empire, and his first move is actually incredibly ruthless.
Yes. Before he can implement any grand vision, he has to optimize the machine. He immediately sells off or outright shuts down 150 underperforming factories across the globe.
150 factories.
Yes, saving the company $2.6 billion. He actively dumps highly commoditized, low-margin foods from their portfolio, things like basic tomato paste and dry pasta.
Why drop pasta and tomato paste? People are always going to buy basic groceries. It seems like guaranteed money.
Because Brabeck recognized early that the era of simply providing cheap bulk calories was over. Those are race-to-the-bottom commodity markets where the only competitive advantage is price. And Walmart will always beat you on price.
Right.
In the year 2000, he pitched a radical new vision to his board of directors. He wanted to transform Nestlé from a traditional food and beverage company into what he termed a nutrition, health, and wellness company, or NHW.
NHW.
And his rationale for this, his core revelation, is honestly one of the most profound macroeconomic insights in this entire analysis.
The calorie inversion paradigm. I love this concept. Explain what he saw that the rest of the industry missed.
Well, Brabeck looked at the broad sweep of human history. For about 200 years, from the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, there was a direct, linear, and proportional relationship between the number of calories a society had available and its average life expectancy.
More calories simply meant you lived longer.
Exactly. It was a triumph of agricultural and food processing technology. But in the 1990s, specifically in the developed world, that paradigm completely inverted. For the first time in human history, having access to too many calories meant your life expectancy started to fall. The abundance of processed food was creating chronic disease.
But the complexity for a truly global company like Nestlé was that they didn't just operate in the developed West. Half the world, the developing nations, was still suffering from historic malnourishment. They desperately needed affordable, dense nutrients.
Exactly. So Brabeck realized Nestlé was facing a bifurcated crisis. They had to solve both problems simultaneously under one corporate umbrella. They had to re-engineer their products to provide better, fewer calories in the West, while simultaneously providing nutrient-dense, affordable calories in the developing world.
Okay, conceptually, that sounds brilliant. But how do you actually do that without destroying your sales overnight? Because let's be honest, people buy processed junk food because it tastes incredible. If you just strip out the salt, the sugar, and the fat to make it healthy, consumers will just walk across the aisle and buy Pepsi or Kraft instead.
Right. Taste is the ultimate dictator of the market.
So how did they solve that?
This is where Nestlé introduced the internal 60/40 Plus cast. It's a brilliant mechanism for managing risk during a product transition. Every single product they reformulated had to pass a blind taste test where at least 60% of consumers preferred it over the nearest competitor's product.
That's the 60/40 part. It guarantees you don't lose market share based on flavor.
Exactly. And the plus part meant the product also had to simultaneously meet a strict, newly defined nutritional standard. So less salt, less sugar, fewer trans fats, or the addition of essential vitamins.
But mandating that a product be both healthier and tastier is easy to put on a PowerPoint slide. You have to actually invent the science to make that physically possible.
Precisely. And that requires capital. Under Brabeck, Nestlé's research and development spending exploded to levels unseen in the food industry. By 2014, they were spending $1.6 billion annually purely on R&D.
1.6 billion.
Yeah, that was 1.8% of their massive global sales, spread across 32 distinct global R&D centers. To put that massive investment in perspective, competitors like PepsiCo, Mondelez, and Danone were entirely stagnant, spending only between 1.1% and 1.3% of their sales on R&D.
So what does a $1.6 billion R&D budget actually buy you when it comes to food? It buys the science of salt. Stefan Katzikos, their EVP of R&D, gives an explanation in the text that sounds more like advanced nanotechnology than cooking.
He pointed out the fundamental biological problem. Historically, if you just reduce the volume of salt in a recipe, you instantly lose market share. The taste profile goes flat.
Right, the human tongue craves the salt.
Exactly. So Nestle couldn't just take the salt out. Instead, they employed advanced material science. They figured out how to isolate and coat the other ingredients in the product at a microscopic level so they wouldn't absorb the salt into their matrix.
Wait, they coated the ingredients?
Yes. By preventing the salt from absorbing into the bulk of the food, they could put far less total salt in the recipe overall. But they engineered the physical structure of the snack so that the small amount of salt that was there remained entirely crystallized right on the surface.
Oh, that's wild.
Yeah, so when the consumer takes a bite, that surface salt immediately contacts the tongue's receptors, delivering the full expected blast of salty flavor before dissolving instantly. You get 100% of the taste profile with a fraction of the actual sodium intake.
That is incredible. It shows how Brabeck was asking his shareholders to take an immense long-term risk. He was telling them to abandon the guaranteed volume-driven profits of churning out cheap junk food and instead rely on a highly scientific, incredibly expensive long-term R&D model.
But it worked because the 60-40+ test ensured they never compromised on the consumer's primary driver, which is taste.
Now, I have to play the skeptic here, because there is a glaring contradiction in this entire narrative. We're talking about high-minded nutrition, material science, and curing global health epidemics. But if you walk into any grocery store today, Nestlé is still one of the largest purveyors of candy and chocolate in the world.
Yes, they are.
If they are truly, fundamentally a nutrition, health, and wellness company, why do they still sell chocolate? Why not just divest it entirely, like Danone did when they sold off their beer and cheese divisions?
It is the ultimate corporate paradox of this case study. The case addresses this directly, quoting Janet Voot, who was their global head of public affairs. Her defense is essentially pragmatic. She argues basically, if we sell our highly profitable candy business to some private equity firm that doesn't care at all about public health or sustainable sourcing, how does that help society?
I see.
She says the chocolate will still be made, but likely worse. So we have a corporate responsibility to stay in the category and use our R&D to make even the treats healthier.
Is that a brilliant, pragmatic justification? Or just a really convenient, beautifully worded excuse to hold on to a highly lucrative business that boasts a 13% profit margin?
To be entirely analytical about it, it is almost certainly both. It is a highly profitable division that generates the massive free cash flow required to subsidize that $1.6 billion R&D budget. However, to truly understand how Nestle internally reconciles holding on to the chocolate while pushing a health agenda, you have to understand the specific theoretical framework they adopted in 2005 to guide their entire corporate philosophy.
Which brings us to creating shared value, or CSV. And the origin of this framework starts with a quote that I think tells you everything you need to know about Peter Brabeck's specific mindset. At the 2004 World Economic Forum in Davos, surrounded by global elites who are all patting themselves on the back, talking about their corporate charity programs, Brabeck stands up and essentially says, "I don't believe in companies giving back to society."
Which, out of context, sounds like the stereotypical greedy corporate villain.
Exactly, like who says that? But then he explains his logic. He argues that a company shouldn't be stealing from society in the first place. If your core business model requires you to extract value, damage the environment, or harm health, and then you try to apologize by writing a charity check at the end of the year, you are failing.
Right.
The daily operation of the business should inherently create value for the society it operates in.
That concept is a radical, fundamental departure from the standard corporate social responsibility, or CSR, playbook that every other company was using at the time.
Yeah.
Brabeck realized he needed a rigorous intellectual framework to legitimize this view to his shareholders. So he partnered with two heavyweights from Harvard Business School, Professor Michael Porter and Mark Kramer. Together, they spent a year codifying this concept of creating shared value. CSV is fundamentally structurally different from CSR, or traditional philanthropy.
How so?
CSV is the core belief that creating value for society is not a side project. It is the optimal, primary strategy to create long-term financial value for the shareholders.
To make this concrete for the executives, they designed the CSV pyramid. Imagine a three-layered pyramid. At the very base, the absolute minimum requirement to operate is compliance. You obey local laws, you follow basic business principles, and you maintain a strict code of conduct. You cannot build a company without that foundation.
Right.
The middle layer is sustainability. This is essentially defensive. It is about protecting the future. You manage your environmental footprint so you don't deplete the natural resources your factories rely on. But the very apex of the pyramid is creating shared value. For Nestlé, they focus this top layer specifically on three areas where their business intersects with global needs: nutrition, water, and rural development.
And the defining characteristic of CSV is that it demands operational implementation. It cannot be delegated to a PR department. And the key city is a perfect illustrative example of this in the figure of Jose Lopez. He was the executive in charge of operations for Nestlé's 460 global factories. When the CSV mandate came down, Lopez flatly refused to create a head of sustainability position for his division.
Why? What do you want a dedicated expert overseeing that?
Well, Lopez argued that if sustainability was pushed off to a separate, isolated officer outside of the daily operational chain of command, it would be ignored when quarterly production targets got tight. It would fail. So he made CSV a strict, non-negotiable operational mandate for every single factory manager.
By 2012, they were making these massive, public, heavily audited commitments to these goals. And crucially, these commitments were tied directly to the performance reviews and bonuses of executive board members. It wasn't a glossy report. It was the executive's actual job on the line. I want to try and clarify the difference between CSR and CSV with an analogy for you listening.
Go for it.
Corporate social responsibility is like owning a massive, heavily polluting private jet and then buying carbon offsets to feel better about it. It's a guilt tax on a bad model. Creating shared value is looking at the landscape, realizing jet fuel is getting expensive and emissions are being regulated, so you invest your capital to invent a solar-powered jet, you fly it cheaper than the competition, and you sell the clean technology at a massive premium. The good deed is the profit engine.
That analogy perfectly captures the alignment of profit and societal benefit. But the theory of CSV only matters if it survives the reality of the factory floor.
Right. How does this lofty Harvard Business School theory actually function in the dirt, the water, and the iron of the real world? Let's look at how they tackled the water crisis. As we discussed earlier, Nestlé was facing intense coordinated backlash, including devastating activist documentaries accusing their massive bottling plants of depleting local water tables and leaving communities dry.
This is where Jose Lopez's operational mandate was really put to the test. He needed a way to force his factory managers to care about water conservation when the financial incentives didn't naturally align.
What do you mean?
Well, in many parts of the world, a factory can pump water out of a local aquifer, essentially for free. If the water is free, how do you convince a finance committee to approve a $10 million capital expenditure for a water recycling machine?
So what did Lopez do? He implemented something deeply wonky, but incredibly effective.
He created an internal notional value for water. He decreed that, strictly on the internal accounting books used for project approvals, water would no longer be considered free. It would cost between 1 and 5 Swiss francs per cubic meter, depending on how severely water-stressed the local region was.
Wait, so they just made up a fake price. How does lying to yourself on a spreadsheet actually save physical water in the real world?
It's not lying. It's a brilliant application of behavioral economics and corporate finance. By forcing his factory managers to treat a free, abundant resource as an artificially expensive, scarce commodity on their balance sheets, he instantly changed the math on capital expenditures.
I see.
Suddenly, a factory manager could financially justify spending millions of dollars on cutting-edge water-saving technology. Because on the 10-year projection paper, they were saving an absolute fortune on this artificially expensive water. It unlocked the capital needed to innovate.
And the ultimate physical result of that internal accounting trick is the Jalisco factory in Mexico. Jalisco is a highly water-stressed, arid desert state. Nestlé built a sprawling dairy processing factory there that is classified as a zero water footprint facility.
The engineering behind this is remarkable. They don't pump groundwater to run the cooling towers or clean the vats. Instead, they literally capture the water vapor that naturally rises off the fresh cow's milk as it evaporates during the heating and condensation process.
Wait, they capture the steam from the milk?
Yes, they capture that vapor, run it through advanced treatment systems, and recycle it endlessly to run the factory operations.
They are literally squeezing the water out of cow's milk to run a massive industrial facility in the middle of a desert. And by doing that, they save 1.6 million liters of local groundwater from being pumped every single day. That is the daily water consumption equivalent of 6,400 local people. That is CSV in its purest form. The factory becomes hyper-resilient to future droughts, and the local community gets to keep its aquifer.
Now let's pivot from the water to the dirt, specifically rural development and agricultural sourcing. Nestlé, as a massive buyer of commodities, was a primary target for Greenpeace. In 2010, Greenpeace activists dressed in orangutan costumes literally stormed and disrupted Nestlé's annual shareholder meeting.
Wow.
Yeah, they were protesting massive deforestation in Southeast Asia caused by palm oil production, which Nestlé used in countless products. Now, traditionally, Nestlé was buying this palm oil on the open commodities market from third-party mega suppliers like Cargill.
And here is a brutal truth from the text. Nestlé realized that relying on third-party certifications like an NGO stamping a farm's output as sustainable was cheap, easy, and largely useless.
Why was it useless?
Because the NGOs simply didn't have the manpower or resources to actually enforce those standards deep in the jungle. In fact, Nestlé deployed their own auditors and found that the only documented instance of child labor in their specific supply chain was at a farm that had a piece of paper declaring it certified.
Certifications had basically become a rubber stamp that obscured reality. So Nestlé made a monumental decision. They decided to bypass the certifications and in many cases bypass the massive commodity brokers entirely to build their own massive internal traceability program.
But the sheer scale of that intervention sounds like an operational nightmare. The case notes that by 2013, they directly employed an army of 1,500 agronomists. They cultivated and distributed 74 million disease-resistant coffee plantlets directly to small farmers. They engaged directly, one-on-one, with 413,000 individual dairy farmers worldwide.
It's massive.
How does a corporate headquarters in Switzerland manage 400,000 separate contracts with tiny rural farms in developing nations? Isn't it infinitely easier to just sign one massive check to Cargill and let them deal with it?
It is infinitely easier in the short term, but it is incredibly fragile in the long term. The head of agriculture at Nestlé explains the strategic CSV logic behind this massive logistical undertaking. By deploying those agronomists and doing the hard, slow work of building local infrastructure, improving yields, building schools, financing wells, they secure an unbreakable proprietary supply chain.
What exactly do they gain that offsets the cost of 1,500 agronomists?
They gain stability. They avoid the massive chaotic supply and price fluctuations of the global open market. They avoid currency risks because they are sourcing locally. And crucially, they avoid the systemic corruption and import bribes often required when bringing massive shipments of commodities through foreign ports.
Wow.
The social good lifting 400,000 farmers out of grinding poverty is the exact specific mechanism that secures the raw materials Nestlé needs to run its factories.
Okay, so we have the water and the dirt. Now for the iron. This brings us to the third core pillar of their CSV strategy, nutrition, and specifically the challenge of micronutrient fortification. The public health data in Central West Africa showed a devastating reality. Up to 90% of children in the region were suffering from anemia.
Which is a severe iron deficiency that stunts cognitive and physical development.
Exactly. Now, a traditional pharmaceutical company or a traditional government aid program might try to invent a new iron pill or a medical supplement and then attempt to build a massive new distribution network to get those pills into rural clinics.
Right, which takes years and billions of dollars.
But Nestlé took a CSV approach. They didn't try to change local behavior or build a new network. They simply looked at what the population was already eating on a daily basis.
And they identified the Maggi Bouillon Cube. It is a simple, incredibly cheap seasoning cube that is absolutely ubiquitous across all socioeconomic classes in that specific region. Families cook with it essentially every single day.
So the distribution network already exists. The product is already loved. The challenge is the chemistry. How do you put iron into a bouillon cube without it tasting like rust?
That was the hurdle for the R&D team. They had to find a way to fortify the cube without altering the flavor profile or causing the other ingredients to oxidize and spoil. They eventually isolated a specific compound ferric pyrophosphate that could be successfully integrated into the Maggi cube while still passing that unforgiving 60/40 plus taste test.
The scale of the impact from that single chemical breakthrough is unparalleled. By 2014, by leveraging this existing highly profitable distribution network, a strategy they call popularly positioned products, or PPPs, they were selling 180 billion servings of micronutrient fortified foods annually across 55 countries.
180 billion.
Yeah. They tackled a massive systemic health crisis, not with a charity program, but with an optimized, highly profitable consumer product.
This deep systemic obsession with proprietary science-based solutions, the vapor extraction for water, the army of agronomists, the molecular iron fortification, it all leads directly into what the case study outlines as their final frontier. Because if you think squeezing water out of milk is an ambitious piece of engineering, their leap into pharma foods and the microbiome pushes the boundaries of what a food company is.
We are moving into territory that genuinely sounds like science fiction now. Let's start with Nestlé Nutrition, which is their infant division. We talked extensively about the trauma of the 1970s formula boycott and how it forced them to embrace science.
Well, by the 2010s, that embrace of science had evolved to a staggering degree. Their R&D division was no longer just trying to make a safe powder. They were actively mapping the exact, minute nutrient changes that occur in a mother's natural breast milk, customizing their data based on the specific gender of the child and its exact developmental age in weeks.
Oh wait, human breast milk changes depending on if the baby is a boy or a girl.
Yes, the lipid and protein structures naturally adapt. And Nestle was using that data to develop a machine. The case literally describes it as a Nespresso-like machine for the nursery that takes bespoke, highly specialized instant formula capsules to create nutritionally precise bottles customized for the individual biochemistry of the baby.
The leap from mass-produced formula tins to molecularly customized, gender-specific capsules is mind-bending. But they didn't stop at infants. In 2011, they formed Nestlé Health Science, or NHS.
Right.
The explicit stated goal of NHS is to essentially create a totally new industry category that sits right in the gray area between the grocery store and the pharmacy. They are attempting to treat serious, life-threatening chronic diseases using highly engineered food instead of traditional drugs.
The clinical data coming out of NHS is remarkable, and it represents a philosophical shift in medicine. Traditional big pharma generally looks for a single, powerful molecule, a single drug, to cure an illness or suppress a symptom. Nestlé's scientific theory is that chronic conditions, things like diabetes, Alzheimer's, or severe gastrointestinal issues, develop over decades of metabolic dysfunction.
Okay, so a pill won't just instantly fix it.
Right. Therefore, they require complex, continuous dietary support to manage and reverse over years, rather than a single chemical intervention.
Let's look at a concrete example of this. NHS developed what they call an immunonutrition formula. It's designed for patients to consume in the weeks before and after undergoing major surgery.
When a human body undergoes surgery, the trauma causes a massive metabolic stress response, which heavily depletes the immune system and leaves the patient highly vulnerable to post-operative infections. This specialized nutritional shake is loaded with specific amino acids, lipids, and nucleotides, designed to preemptively fortify the immune system before the scalpel even cuts.
And the results in the clinical trials. It decreased post-surgical infections by 52%. By doing that, it ends up saving the broader healthcare system roughly $2,800 per patient by reducing hospital stays. And there are more examples. They developed a specialized supplement that reduces the frequency of episodes in patients suffering from drug-resistant epilepsy by up to 90%. How does a food supplement achieve what powerful neurological drugs cannot?
It alters the metabolic state of the brain. Certain specialized fatty acids can force the brain to run on ketones rather than glucose, which stabilizes the electrical activity that causes the seizures. And from a pure business perspective, the genius of Nestlé Health Science is the regulatory arbitrage.
What do you mean by regulatory arbitrage?
The experts in the case point out that dietary supplements and medical foods have significantly lower regulatory hurdles to clear than traditional pharmaceutical drugs. The FDA approval process for a new drug can take a decade and cost $1 billion. Because Nestlé is using nutritional compounds, their R&D is significantly cheaper, and the time required to get a life-saving product to market is vastly accelerated.
And this intense scientific pivot extends beyond internal medicine right to the surface of the body. When Nestlé fully acquired the dermatology company Galderma, they created Nestlé Skin Health.
And their approach there was entirely consistent with their new NHW paradigm. They had a legacy $50 million high-margin business selling topical antibiotics for severe acne.
And they just killed it.
They voluntarily discontinued the entire profitable product line. They did this to align with global health initiatives fighting the escalating crisis of antibiotic resistance. Instead of just selling creams to kill bacteria, they redirected their research to deeply study the microbiome, the half-kilo of diverse living bacteria that naturally colonizes human skin.
They are researching how to treat skin health preventatively by balancing the ecosystem rather than nuking it with antibiotics. The text even mentions they are studying the biochemical link between the brain and the skin, operating on the theory that treating visible skin issues is actually about treating underlying systemic nutritional and biochemical imbalances.
Which is a complete paradigm shift.
It is. Imagine it is 5 or 10 years from now. You go to your doctor because you are suffering from clinical depression, or perhaps you're showing signs of early-stage Alzheimer's, and instead of the doctor writing you a prescription for a traditional pharmaceutical like Prozac, they write you a prescription for a highly specific, molecularly customized Nestlé nutritional shake. It completely obliterates the line between the grocery store and the pharmacy,
It really does.
which forces a massive pragmatic question. If this strategy is so revolutionary, if the clinical trials are working and the potential market is literally every aging human on Earth, why isn't Wall Street absolutely throwing money at them? Why aren't they valued at the multiples of a massive disruptive biotech startup?
That question brings us crashing back down to the harsh reality of global finance. Despite these incredible sci-fi innovations and the clear societal value being created, Nestle is fundamentally misunderstood by the financial markets.
Because if you just look at the top-line financials, they are incredibly solid. In 2014, they hit $15 billion in pure profit. Over a 20-year span, their stock performance completely outpaced their major competitors like Unilever and Coke.
Yeah, they're making money.
And they routinely lead every major global sustainability index, the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, the Carbon Disclosure Project, Oxfam's Behind the Brand scorecard. On paper, by every available metric, they are winning.
However, as Stephen Kindler, their head of investor relations, points out in the case, the financial analysts on Wall Street simply don't know how to categorize or value them. The architecture of Wall Street is highly siloed.
How so?
The specific analysts assigned to cover Nestlé are experts in packaged food companies. Their financial models are built to track the global commodity prices of cocoa, the volume metrics of instant coffee, and the shelf space dynamics of chocolate bars.
So when Nestle tries to pitch them on immunonutrition and the skin microbiome,
The analysts literally ignore the health science and skin health divisions in their financial models. They assign them zero growth value because they do not possess the biotech expertise required to accurately value preventative, personalized nutritional therapies. Furthermore, Wall Street is fundamentally wired to demand short-term, 90-day quarterly returns.
and CSV is the exact opposite of a 90-day play.
Exactly. Brabeck and Paul Bulk, the CEO who followed him, are playing a 10 to 20-year game. Creating shared value takes a decade to show concrete returns on a balance sheet. You simply do not rebuild the agricultural infrastructure of rural India or invent a cure for drug-resistant epilepsy in a single financial quarter.
So they are actively punished by the markets for being long-term visionaries, but we also have to acknowledge that they aren't perfect. Despite their vast internal reforms and armies of agronomists, Nestle still operates with a massive target on its back.
Oh, absolutely. The reality of running an 8,500 brand company across 197 sovereign countries is that you will inevitably stumble. And your massive scale means those stumbles have severe consequences.
Right.
Even as they are building highly engineered zero-water factories in Mexico, they face fierce, sustained protests in California, accused by activists of exacerbating local droughts by aggressively bottling natural spring water for profit.
And the supply chain is just so impossibly deep and opaque. In 2015, Nestle actually self-reported the results of an internal investigation that uncovered systemic forced labor in the Thai seafood industry, which was deep in the supply chain for their pet food division.
Yeah, they were actively trying to audit the system and fix it, but the resulting negative publicity was immense. And of course, as we discussed, the tragic legacy of the 1970s infant formula stigma still rightfully lingers for many global health activists today.
Paul Bulkus summarized the inherent tension of the corporate philosophy by calling CSV and the nutrition focus the yin and yang of the company. The strategic intent and the operational execution are deeply integrated. But the financial market struggles to accurately price the value of doing the right thing. And in a massive, fractured, globalized supply chain, achieving flawless perfection is an almost impossible daily battle.
It's the ultimate irony of modern corporate existence, really.
It is. They are penalized by Wall Street for being too visionary and long-term, and they are simultaneously penalized by global NGOs for not achieving instant utopian perfection across a massive, messy global footprint. Can a massive publicly traded company truly serve two demanding masters, the relentless, unforgiving demand of the quarterly earnings report and the 20-year horizon of planetary and societal good?
That ultimately is the central, unresolved question of modern capitalism that this specific case study forces us to confront.
What an epic, expansive journey we have covered today. We started with a 19th century German pharmacist tinkering in a lab to save infants who couldn't breastfeed. We watched the company survive a massive, scarring global boycott in the 1970s that completely rewired their corporate psychology.
Yeah.
We saw Peter Brabeck completely pivot a massive, profitable junk food empire away from empty calories, recognizing before anyone else that the era of simply feeding people was over. And we saw that massive pivot manifest in incredible physical ways, from squeezing water out of evaporating milk in a Mexican desert to protect an aquifer, to literally treating drug-resistant epilepsy with bespoke, molecularly precise nutrition.
The evolution from a purveyor of shelf-stable, convenient calories to a pioneer of advanced health science is a testament to the sheer power and operational reality of the creating shared value framework.
And that is the biggest takeaway for you listening. Whether you are running a small startup team, managing a local supply chain, or directing an entire multinational division, you have to look closely at this CSV framework. Stop thinking of doing good as a charity side hustle, a guilt tax, or a PR campaign managed by an isolated department.
It has to be core to the business.
If your core product, your actual daily profit engine, isn't fundamentally solving a real, tangible problem for society, you are living on borrowed time. Eventually, as we saw with the rest of the food industry, you are going to be priced out by generic competitors, regulated out of existence by angry governments, or simply innovated into irrelevance. The value creation and the societal benefit must be the exact same mechanism. Which leaves us with one final, slightly provocative thought to chew on long after this audio stops playing. We've talked extensively about how Nestlé is actively blurring the line between food and medicine. If their billion-dollar R&D bet is right and personalized, preventive nutrition becomes the primary way we treat chronic diseases over the next century. What happens to our global healthcare systems? What happens to the entire medical industry when the local grocery store aisle is suddenly more vital to your daily longevity than the hospital pharmacy? Think about the massive regulatory and cultural battles to come. Who regulates your dinner when your dinner is literally your medicine? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems and the world around you, and we'll see you next time.